Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to the Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana Das. I'm very, very happy to see you here. Last week, we continued our introduction to Karma Yoga. We spoke about action without attachment, what it means to be liberated. We covered verses 47 and 53 in the second chapter. Tonight, we forge ahead, heading into the home stretch of the second chapter of the Bhagavad-gita, which, by the way, is an exceptionally long chapter. There are two chapters of considerable length in the Gita, the second and the 18th. So if it feels like we've been in the second chapter for a long time, that's just a reasonable response to a correct perception. We have, because this is one of the longer chapters of the Gita. Tonight, we'll talk about symptoms of transcendental knowledge. Pratyahara, turning the senses inward, withdrawing the senses, controlling the mind and the senses, and acquiring a higher taste. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that as we move along. As is our custom, I'm going to read through the verses in the cluster that we are covering this evening, which are verses 254 to 61. So here we go. Arjuna said, this is now 254, Arjuna said, O Keshava, Krishna, what are the characteristics of a person who has mastered the art of perfect meditation? What is the language of one whose intelligence is sound? How do they speak, sit, and move through the world? Verse 255, the Blessed Lord, Krishna, said, O Partha, Arjuna, when one is free from all varieties of material desires that arise from the mind and with a purified mind, finds satisfaction in the self alone, then such a person is understood to be in a state of transcendental consciousness. Verse 56. One whose mind is free from attachment, fear, and anger, who is undisturbed by the arrival of the threefold miseries of material life, nor euphoric at the arrival of causes for happiness, is called a sage of steady mind. One who, in all circumstances, remains unfazed by whatever fortune or misfortune comes their way, neither celebrating it nor scorning it, is firmly fixed in perfect knowledge. Verse 58, one who can withdraw their senses from the objects of the senses, as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into its shell, is firmly fixed in perfect consciousness. Verse 59, though the objects of the senses recede, for the embodied soul who abstains from them, the taste for such objects remains. By acquiring a higher taste for that which is far superior, the taste for sense objects fades as well. O son of Kunti, this is verse 60, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, the senses are so powerful and impulsive that even the mind of one who is capable of discernment may be forcibly carried away. Verse 61, one who retains complete control of the senses through self-discipline and whose consciousness remains linked to me is known to be one whose wisdom is firmly established. So those are our verses. And as is my habit, I sat with this section of the Gita for a while, tried to think on them, sit with them, be with them, enter into some relationship with them, just to see what they inspired me to think of. And they inspired me to think of comic books. This is The Avengers, issue number 2. I'm going to tell you a tragic story about this issue of The Avengers. As a child, I had this copy. I was always into Marvel comics. I wasn't really into DC comics so much. And so part of my regular routine as a child was to get my mother to take me to the village green in the town that I lived in. And there were 2 places that I immediately went to in the store that was in this cluster of stores. One was to the plastic model sets where I could get models of movie monsters. I was 7. And the other was to the comic book stand. And early on in my comic book collecting life, I picked up a copy of The Avengers, number 2. And because I don't get rid of things so easily, I held on to all the comic books that I collected for years and years until I was a teenager. And one sad day, I decided I'd outgrown these comic books and I should practice detachment. I should let them go. And I got rid of them to who knows where. Sad. Naturally, I would love to still have this copy now. My favorite comic, as I got a little bit older, was Doctor Strange. Anyone who knows me a little bit should understand why Doctor Strange would be my favorite comic. I mean, he lives in a completely psychedelic world, and a whole alternative reality. And it was when I was a child that I started thinking that this could be real, that the limits of our material consciousness were hiding other realms, other strata of reality, other dimensions that were just as real as this dimension, but that we didn't have access to. And I started thinking about how to develop the power to access these higher states of expanded consciousness. Perhaps some of you have seen the film Doctor Strange. Here we see the Ancient One knocking Doctor Strange right out of his own body so that he would have a glimpse of the other dimensions that he otherwise did not have access to by virtue of the constraints of his material senses. And in this way, the Ancient One qualified herself to become Doctor Strange's guru by showing him something he had not seen in a gift shop. He became convinced that this was the person to teach him. However, and the film's been out for a while, so I will not worry about spoilers. It turns out that aside from not actually looking very much like the original Ancient One in the comic, the Ancient One had a disqualification, an imperfection. She was cheating. She was using forbidden wisdom to extend her own life. And in the mind of one of Dr. Strange's peers, the revelation of her imperfection was a disqualification. And he rejected her post-mortem as his So now that brings us to my question for you. Is there anyone at all who's qualified to be a guru? In essence, this is what Arjuna is asking. So now I'm going to come back to the verse, and I'm going to come back to each verse and elaborate a little bit on each one. And we'll talk about this issue of who, if anyone, is qualified to be a guru. Arjuna's question is this, or his request is a description. What are the characteristics of a person who has mastered the art of perfect meditation? What is the language of one whose intelligence is sound? How do they speak, sit, and move through the world? So please think about this question. How would you answer it? If you were to consider accepting a guru, a relationship where you make a commitment to someone who you think is qualified to open your eyes in a way that they've never been opened before, and to see aspects of reality, including aspects of yourself, that you previously and on your own did not have access to. What would those qualifications be? Is there anyone who you think is qualified to be a guru in this day and age? This is a hot button question in modern yoga. There are entire social media, Facebook conversations and threads about the dark side of yoga insofar as charismatic leaders and cults and giving up your power. And what does it mean to surrender to an absolute authority? And is that really a safe thing to do? And should anybody ever do that? Is that ever wise under any circumstances? It is a great leap of faith. And so in whom can we place our faith in this way? Here comes a response. Seems like most student-guru relationships are commerce-based these days. Good point. There's a history of an expectation that when one submits to a guru, that there is a financial component to it, that one is expected to give what is in Sanskrit called guru dakshin, or donation to the guru. And in modern yoga, of course, the whole thing has become a very commercial enterprise. Yoga studios are commerce-driven, secular environments. And yoga celebrities, yoga superstars, are basically headliners at celebrity yoga events. So what do you think? I'll throw this out there for you now before I give my opinion on this. Is there a financial component to an authentic guru-disciple relationship? To paraphrase the Buddha, let no one be your head. Well, I'm not sure of the original quote, so I'm not sure how you're paraphrasing. So this brings up the question is a guru necessary? Are we our own best teachers? Can we understand the truth without the assistance of someone else? Doesn't it always end up exploitative? Well, that seems to be the real question. Is it possible to enter into a relationship like this in good faith and not end up being exploited? In other words, is there a person who has the actual qualifications? Well, as we look at these verses coming up, we're going to hear from Krishna what his qualifications, what his sense of the qualifications are. But let me circle back. We had a couple of other comments here. I cannot think of anyone, but that does not mean there isn't one. okay? An entirely reasonable way to think about it. Just because I haven't met someone who's qualified for the position yet doesn't mean that that person doesn't exist. It just may mean that I haven't seen that person. Thank you. I think we definitely need to study with qualified teachers, but that is a relationship that should develop slowly over time and requires tremendous trust on both ends. That sounds like a very intelligent way to go about it, because it is on both ends. A qualified teacher wants to engage with a qualified student, or a qualified guru wants to engage with a qualified disciple. And that circles back to the first comment was, is this all a matter of financial transaction? In modern yoga, the way I navigate this is that a student-teacher relationship is an exchange, involves an exchange of money. It's a professional relationship. Whereas a guru-disciple relationship is categorically different and may and should, in all likelihood, involve the student giving donations to the teacher in exchange for such teachings. But there's no set price there. A lot of times what happens is we conflate guru-disciple and teacher-student. The student-guru, the teacher-disciple, that's, I think, one of the places where we get into a lot of trouble. Whereas if we make a clear distinction between a student-teacher relationship that is a time-based, commerce-driven relationship and a guru-disciple relationship, which is not time-based and doesn't have a mandatory financial component in terms of a price tag, I think that helps us navigate this particular area a lot more safely. Here we go. I think this is tricky. This is certainly something to be learned from others who understand something you don't understand. But honestly, I have a hard time believing that having a guru is a necessary thing. Okay, that's reasonable. The donation sounds like tithing. For those who go to church, you are partially giving that donation for the benefit of studying with the pastor. So yeah, I think that's legitimate in terms of the guru-disciple relationship is a matter of spiritual practice and understanding, whereas the teacher-student relationship, it can be spiritual, but not in quite the same way. It's the difference between information and knowledge. Making some generalizations, but that's another way. All right, so we've played around with this idea. Is it possible for someone to have these qualifications? Now let's go back and look at those qualifications again as we circle back through the rest of the verses. Thank you all very, very much for sharing your thoughts on whether or not it is possible for someone to be qualified to be your guru and what you would think about when you think about entering into such a relationship. Okay, here's the verse we're going to chant this evening, which is chapter 255. I will chant and you can chant back. So this verse is spoken by Krishna, and therefore it is preceded by the phrase Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Prajahati Yada Kaman Sarvan Partha Manogatan Atmanyevatmana Tushtaha Stikta Pragyastha Dochyate. All right, here we go. Our translation once again. The Blessed Lord said, O Partha, Arjuna, when one is free from all varieties of material desires that arise from the mind, and with a purified mind finds satisfaction in the self alone, then such a person is understood to be in a state of transcendental consciousness. So I've highlighted some of what I think is particularly important here in this verse, worthy of special consideration. The first qualification, free from all varieties of material desires that arise from the mind. Notice the qualification of desires. Not just desires, not just desirelessness, not someone who has eradicated desires, but who is free from all varieties of material desires. Material desires means desires associated with the senses, with the objects of the senses, with bringing the senses into contact with the objects of the senses for the sake of enjoyment or the pursuit of happiness through this temporary material body. And these material desires arise from the mind. So this is a statement about the fluctuations of the mind. All the varieties are the fluctuations, and the source of the desires is the mind. So as the mind fluctuates, it generates desires, attachments and aversions, likes and dislikes. So here, Krishna is describing someone who has attained a degree of stillness of mind, or not just stillness of mind, rather, but rather attained a kind of detachment from the fluctuations of the mind. So the mind may still be generating desires, but when a person is not moved by those desires, when the fluctuations of the mind don't affect one, that's the state of someone who is engaged in the process of purifying the mind. A lot of times we hear this yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. And we think, wow, if you do any kind of meditation, you watch the fluctuations of your mind, you become conscious of just how much activity is there, then you're thinking, how am I ever going to do that? Well, there's a preliminary stage. And that preliminary stage is developing a kind of indifference to those fluctuations. It's not that the fluctuations have to stop first. Before stopping the fluctuations, one develops the capacity to not say how high every time the mind says jump. So that's what's being described here. And then the second thing, find satisfaction in the self alone. The self, ourselves, our pure spiritual nature, is so far out that if we were able to experience it, we would experience a kind of satisfaction unlike any satisfaction we can hope to attain through the pursuit of the fulfillment of all the desires that arise from the fluctuations of the mind. So here Krishna is saying with a purified mind, one is able to experience this satisfaction. So when we think about how all too often there's some element of exploitation in a guru-disciple relationship, handing over one's power, so to speak, which I think is a little bit of a misconception of what it means to have a guru. It doesn't mean rendering yourself powerless, giving up your power. It shouldn't. But when we surrender, when we submit to the discipline of a guru and thus become a disciple, voluntarily and with knowledge that backs up our faith, the person that we're looking for in order to feel comfortable investing in a relationship of this kind is someone who is not going to act on the fluctuations of the mind that suggest enjoyment through exploitation of the disciple. So here is our first qualification. Okay. In the next verse, By the way, once again, any questions about any of this, go ahead and pop them into the question box, and I'll look for them. All right, the next verse. One whose mind is free from attachment, fear, and anger. There are your big three things: attachment, fear, and anger. Who is undisturbed by the arrival of the threefold miseries of material life, nor euphoric at the arrival of causes for happiness, is called a sage of steady mind. So sometimes we see this phrase in the Bhagavad-gita and in other yoga wisdom texts, the threefold miseries of material life. What do we mean by that? So there are three sources of misery in material life, and here they are: Adi-bhautika, Adi-atmika, and Adi-daivika. They can be understood in this way. Adi-bhautika, miseries arising from within one's body. You get sick. You have a mental disturbance or an illness of some kind. You get the flu. You get old. Your body starts to break down. You get arthritis. You need a hip replacement. The material body is something that can be as much a source of misery as it can be a source of enjoyment. Adi-atmika, miseries that come from other living beings. Anything from a mosquito to your neighbor who plays really loud music late at night, to the people who invade your village and burn everything to the ground and kill everybody. It's just a question of degree. Miseries from other living beings, not just people, but miseries that arise from being eaten by a tiger. Adi-daivika, miseries arising from natural circumstances, earthquakes, hurricanes, blizzards, srirachas, is that how you pronounce it? Windstorms. Mother Nature having a temper tantrum and you being in the way of it. So these are three different sources of miseries that we experience in the material world. When we chant the peace mantra, we chant Om Shanti, 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 peace. Why three times? Because there are three sources of misery in the material world, and it is a benediction that one should experience peace in one's own mind and body, peace in their relationships with other living beings, and peace in their relationship with Mother Nature. So that's where that comes from. 57. One who in all circumstances remains unfazed by whatever fortune or misfortune that comes their way, neither celebrating it nor scorning it, is firmly fixed in perfect knowledge. So, one day late in the summer, there was an old farmer working on his field with his old sick horse. And the farmer felt compassion for the horse, and desiring to make the horse happy in its old age, he let the horse loose and let it just go off to the mountains to live the rest of its life peacefully in nature. And then the neighbors in the nearby came and said, "Oh, what a shame, your horse is gone. That's very unfortunate. You must be very sad. How are you going to live? How are you going to be able to work your land and be prosperous?" And the farmer replied, "Who knows? We shall see." 2 days later, the old horse came back, rejuvenated from having had a nice vacation, and found 12 other horses that were out there younger, healthy horses, and those horses came back with the old horse and just followed the old horse right into the corral. So word got out, the neighbors came by and said, "Oh, what good fortune. You've had such good luck. Now you must be very happy. You have all these horses." And the farmer said, we shall see, perhaps. So the next day, the farmer's only son tries to train one of the new horses, but the farmer's son gets thrown off the horse and he breaks his leg. Neighbors came by and said, "Oh, what misfortune now. Your son won't be able to help you with your broken leg, with his broken leg, and you'll have to do all the work by yourself. How are you going to do that? You must be very sad." And the farmer said, "Well, we shall see, perhaps." A few days later, the emperor's men, emperor's soldiers, came through the village. There'd been a declaration of war with a neighboring country, and the emperor's soldiers were conscripting all the young men from all the villages into the army, except that the farmer's son had a broken leg. So they didn't take him. And the neighbor said, "Wow, what good fortune you have. Your son was not taken away to fight in the war. You must be very happy." And the farmer said, "Well, who knows? Perhaps. We'll see." As time went on, the son's broken leg healed, but the son was left with a limp. And again, the neighbors came and said, "Oh, what bad luck. You can't walk right. It's too bad for you." And the farmer said, "Well, perhaps. We'll see." And as it turned out, the other young boys had been killed in the war. The young men had gone off. And his son, the farmer's son, was really the only able-bodied person, even with his limp, to be able to work. And therefore, the old farmer became very prosperous, whereas everyone else was struggling. And the villagers said, "Oh, how fortunate you are that your son is still with you and working the farm." And the old farmer said, "Perhaps. We shall see." The old farmer actually understood that things that seem like good fortune can turn out to be bad fortune. Things that can seem like bad fortune can turn out to be good fortune. You never know. And this equanimity, not being elated when something seems to go really well and not being really depressed when things seem to go not well. This is actually a position of knowledge, because sometimes things are going to be great, sometimes things are going to be rotten, sometimes things are going to be in between. It is not that the yogi artificially represses emotion, it's that he actually understands, or she understands, things as they are. And that good fortune, bad fortune, temporary and relative. Text 58. One who can withdraw their senses from the objects of the senses, as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into the shell, is firmly fixed in perfect concentration. So this is a very nice description of pratyahara. In the Yoga Sutras, we also have this idea. This is the fifth limb of yoga. We have ethical imperatives, personal observances, physical postures, control of the life force through the breath, and then turning the senses inward. Normally, we look for our happiness and the source of our sustenance by looking outward. And here Krishna is telling us to do something very counterintuitive. Turn inward. Rather than sending the senses out looking for the objects of the senses, withdraw the senses from their objects and look inward. because there's something there that will provide us with a far superior experience of happiness and sustenance than we will ever find by looking outward. Our yoga practice is actually meant to do this. One way we can do this when we're practicing for asana, for example, is developing the habit of taking the seat of the observer and watching yourself do yoga. I have found for myself that I can go deeper into my practice without necessarily doing anything more intense physically, although that tends to happen all by itself. When I remember to constantly pull my senses in such a way so that I am conscious of observing my body from the inside. It's a subtle change of how you go about doing your practice, but that's what our practice is meant for. We can actually have the experience of not being this material body that we inhabit by moving, by using our body in a physical practice of yoga and observing the body as we go through each pose, as we move through each aspect of our practice. Ultimately, after asana and pranayama, then the first preliminary step of meditation, if you were going to do the seated kind of solitary meditation, is this turning the senses inward. Okay. Text 59. Though the objects of the senses recede for the embodied soul who abstains from them, the taste for such objects remains. By acquiring a higher taste for that which is far superior, the taste for sense objects fades as well. So here Krishna is describing a two-step process, reiterating what he said earlier. Ignore the fluctuations of the mind that generate desires. Ignore the desires that the fluctuations of the mind generate. And what happens is there's some distance that's created between ourselves, our senses, and the object that the senses craves. And that's fine. However, there's still that association of pleasure from bringing that object into contact with our senses. Every so often, I will also experience this. There's still an impression on my mind that associates some material pleasure with happiness. And by practice, I watch it show up and I watch it go away again. And as long as I don't act on it, then I know it'll just go away. It's just a matter of having the self-discipline in that moment to not get swept away by the impulse caused by the impression in the mind and the fluctuation in the mind when that particular sense object shows up in my environment. The second step of the process is this higher taste. The awakening of spiritual senses is an experience that is so far superior to the indulgence of the senses when the desire for the satisfaction of the senses arises, that eventually even the taste for that particular thing will also recede. In other words, there's an impression on the mind. And when the mind or the senses come in contact with a particular thing that created that impression, it wants to get that thing and try to fill the impression with that thing. But the combination of ignoring the impulse and experiencing this higher taste of spiritual awakening creates a situation where the impression in the mind itself starts to flatten out, starts to become smooth. It's like a crevice that gradually gets pulled up to the surface and stretched out so that it's not as deep a crevice anymore. So a two-part process: cultivating a kind of authentic indifference to mental impulses, and cultivating an experience of spiritual awareness. Two go together. Otherwise, just the first one is not sustainable. Okay, verse 60. O son of Kunti, Arjuna, the senses are so powerful and impulsive that even the mind of one who is capable of discernment may be forcibly carried away. Later on, we'll hear Krishna say that the mind is the enemy of one who is not controlling it, but the friend of one who has mastered it. And in this case, this is the example of the danger of flirting with a mind that is not yet under control. And even one who understands this, who understands, at least in theory, who's capable of making a distinction between a spiritual impulse and a material impulse, can still be swept away. So therefore, one should never underestimate the power of the mind to convince us that the mind will make us happy. Now, 61. This is a kind of pivotal verse. One who retains complete control of the senses through self-discipline and whose consciousness remains linked to me is known to be one whose wisdom is firmly established. So the Sanskrit in this particular verse, yukta asita matparaha. Yukta, the yoking, the root of the Sanskrit word yoga, linking, connecting. Asita, whose consciousness, mat paraha, mat indicates me, remaining linked to me. So here, Krishna is saying that when one's consciousness is fixed on him, then their wisdom is firmly established. It is the first time that he indicates to Arjuna that he himself is the ultimate object of meditation. So he kind of eases into this idea. And as we move forward, remembering that the pattern in the Bhagavad-gita is elliptical. Krishna will say something, then circle back and get a little deeper into that subject, and then move on, and then come back and go a little deeper. Here's the first time he's actually indicating that he is the object of meditation, and that one whose consciousness remains linked, connected to him, is one who actually has themselves firmly fixed in wisdom or knowledge. So here we have this combination of self-discipline, control of the mind, but also the direction of the mind. So it's not just a matter of nullification of desires or nullification of thought, inactivity of the mind, but rather it's the direction of the mind towards an object of meditation that brings about a higher taste of spiritual experience. And as Krishna elaborates on his own position as the ultimate object of meditation, we will find that he himself is the ultimate source of that higher taste, that to experience Krishna is to experience something beyond what any object in the mundane world could possibly offer us. Okay. So let's do a little recap. The symptoms of the wise are freedom from fear, attachment, and anger. One who understands that they are not this material body, that they are an eternal spirit soul, has nothing to fear, because all fear rolls back to fear of death. And if we understand that we're not this body, then we also understand that we're not going to die. The body will die, but the self is eternal. Therefore, nothing to fear. Free from attachment, understanding that everything material is temporary, and everything spiritual is permanent. One becomes free from attachment to material desires, material projects. And then finally, anger. One who is not influenced by the fluctuations of the mind finds themselves free from anger, and one who understands that those different sources of misery, miseries from the body, miseries from other living beings, miseries from material nature, ultimately, these are all the three qualities of material nature that we discussed earlier in action, and that the spirit soul behind the other person who may be doing something to anger us is not actually the doer of activities. When one develops a little bit of spiritual vision, then one's anger naturally starts to subside. And this is now a symptom of someone who has achieved this kind of wisdom. Not this material body, not in control of the results, therefore we are not attached, and we see the qualities of material nature and the person affected by material nature. So here there are three reasons why one who is possessing transcendental knowledge will have no fear, be free from attachment, and not prone to anger. Other symptoms of the wise: unfazed by good fortune or misfortune, neither despondent in misfortune nor euphoric in good fortune. Doesn't mean we are not authentically happy when happiness comes of its own accord. Happiness comes of its own accord. Unhappiness also comes uninvited, and developing some sense of equilibrium. Happiness will also come uninvited. We strive so hard for happiness. Happiness will come uninvited, and when it does, we accept it. And when unhappiness comes, also uninvited, we also accept it. In fact, Krishna uses the phrase, the word tolerate, both happiness and distress in an earlier verse. So it seems a little counterintuitive to tolerate happiness, but as we advance in yoga, that's actually what we do. The senses are turned inwards. We spend less time looking out for our source of happiness, more time looking inward for an ultimate source of happiness, and thus gain a taste for transcendental experience by virtue of having a sense of spiritual experience, by the awakening of our spiritual senses. The wise retain complete control of the senses through self-discipline, and thus remain free from all varieties of material desires arising from the mind, and engage the mind and senses in a relationship to Krishna, thus obtaining the ultimate highest taste in developing a sense of being able to see, hear, or otherwise feel the Supreme Person present in all activities and everything we experience. All right. Tonight's program has been, and no, that's not tonight's program. That was last week's program. Tonight's program has included a slide that was from last week. It happens like that sometime. All right. What was tonight's program? Let's find out. What did we just discuss? We discussed symptoms of transcendental knowledge. We discussed pratyahara, withdrawing the senses the same way a tortoise withdraws their limbs into a shell. We spoke about controlling the mind and senses and being able to do so, having our control, our self-discipline supported by developing a higher taste by virtue of spiritual experience, awakening the spiritual senses and engaging the mind, directing the mind and the senses in the direction of Krishna, the speaker of the Bhagavad-gita. Any questions? So please, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the question bin. I will, of course, field your questions via email if these questions come up later. My email address is hari@harikirtan.com. While you are thinking of your questions, here's a cool thing. I came across a podcast called Yoga for the Revolution, and there's a really interesting two-part conversation with yoga educator and activist Carol Horton. And she speaks about the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country, which is about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who disappeared for a while after going to jail, and then reinvented himself as Osho. So some of you may have heard of him in one or the other of those incarnations. While he was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, he took his followers and his 50 Rolls Royces out to a town in Oregon and basically took over the town. And it brings up a lot of the questions that we've been discussing this evening with regard to charismatic leaders, and is there any such thing as a person who is trustworthy to take the role of guru and that sort of thing. Anyway, yogafortherevolution.com is the website, and you can find the podcast there. It was a fascinating conversation, and I highly recommend it. It's also got some amazing revelations about the Rolling Stones. Check it out. Okay, we got a couple of questions. Do you think equanimity or equal-mindedness can be callousness towards life? In its authentic and unforced, let me put it this way. It can be if it's artificial. If it's genuine, then it ends up manifesting as what I tend to call compassionate detachment. You can develop a hardness of heart by too much renunciation. For example, if the taste for a particular level of sense enjoyment is so intense, and one that you can't really authentically renounce it, but you try to anyway, and you just keep tamping it down, and you don't develop that higher taste of genuine spiritual experience, then you can become callous. You can become indifferent to the suffering of others. You can be indifferent to your own suffering. In contemporary Buddhism, this is called spiritual bypassing. You artificially do an end around your own authentic needs, emotional needs, physical needs. You do end around the needs of others that you are in relationship with. You defer artificially to an ideal that you are not actually up for. So yeah, I do think that artificial equal-mindedness can result in a kind of callous disregard for life and the lives of others. Whereas an authentic kind of equanimity, an equanimity that comes naturally by the gradual development of spiritual life, I think that is something that does not, that's one way you can tell, actually. If you feel callousness, then there's something amiss with your level of renunciation. If you see callousness in others, there's something amiss in their level of renunciation. So returning to our original question, who is qualified? Then that would be a disqualification, that kind of callousness. One more question. Please elaborate on not feeling angry toward another person when we understand these concepts. So there's a difference between being angry and manifesting anger. If you're being angry, then you've lost control, and your anger is controlling you, and you're thinking, this person has done something to me. If you're manifesting anger, then you can look at the behavior of a person and see, this is a person who is under the influence of the qualities of material nature behaving in this way, and the appropriate response is anger in order to convey to them that what they're doing is wrong or injurious to you or someone else. And so you manifest anger without being controlled by your anger. Does that make sense? And let me know. Next week, we're going to talk about the sequence of illusion, how we roll into this condition of avidya, or not being able to see things as they actually are. We'll cover the topic of meditation in material consciousness, as opposed to spiritual consciousness. How we reverse the sequence of illusion. So we'll get into the psychology of yoga. And we'll talk about the relationship of peace, happiness, and wisdom, covering Gita verses 62 through 68. And that's all, folks. Thank you all very, very much for joining me for this edition of Bhagavad-gita Virtual Satsang, our webinar series. All right, everyone, signing off. Have a great night.